everyone. I'm Pallavi. I'm the VP of Events for CEP Ottawa. For today, we are discussing a very important topic, which is mental health and the climate change, sustainability, environment, and how they're enmeshed, and what we can do to better our mental health through nature as well. So we have some amazing panelists who we're going to speak to, I think I will introduce them. So today we have with us Dr. Katie Hayes, who's a climate change and mental health researcher based in Canada. Her research explores the mental health consequences of climate change with a specific focus on addressing the inequitable risks and impacts on marginalized groups. Katie has published a number of recent articles exploring the topic, and she's currently leading the mental health chapter for the upcoming National Climate Change Health Assessment Report being led by Health Canada. So I invite Katie to kind of tell us more about herself and her work.
Great, just had to find the unmute button. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, I've got shaking heads. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here today and this evening with all of you. I thought I'd provide just kind of a brief primer of some of the work that I do on mental health and climate change. But before I take a deep dive, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about what I mean when I'm talking about our mental health. Because our mental health is not only, when we think of mental health, most people think of mental ill health, right? Or they just go to the definition of this is mentally healthy and this is mentally ill. But really our mental health, like our physical health, it exists on a spectrum. So this is the mental health continuum model, and I really like it. And the more I show it to people, particularly during the pandemic, I think we can all understand how this little odometer works. I'm sorry, I don't know why it was switching slides on me. But at times we might be excelling or thriving, and at other times we might be surviving, struggling, or in crisis. And this is with any big public health threat, whether it be the pandemic or whether it be experiencing issues of climate change. Right now, when we think about the wildfires that are taking place, extreme heat events, I live in Barrie, Ontario, where there was recently a tornado. Many of these emotional spectrums that people feel can shift and throughout their experiences with these public health threats and throughout their lifetime. So when we think about what our mental health, how our mental health is impacted by climate change, what I like to do is just provide a bit of a primer. And this is an image that comes from the US's National Climate Change Assessment that came out in 2016. And for the first time, they had a chapter on mental health. Similarly in Canada, that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing at Health Canada. We'll have a mental health chapter, and this chapter will come out with the whole report in November of this year. But basically what you can see from this slide is that on the left-hand side, we have these climate impacts, whether it be extreme temps, flooding, drought, wildfires, that disproportionately impact people. And they disproportionately impact people who are already experiencing health inequities based on their gender, socioeconomic status, race, age, ability, etc. And then there are a whole host of health outcomes. And the reason I like this slide so much is that it demonstrates that our physical health, our mental health, and our community health are all interconnected. So if something affects our physical health, there are going to be some mental health repercussions and perhaps also community health repercussions. And when we think specifically about how our changing climate can affect our mental health, the data shows us that there are things like increased stress, anxiety, depression, grief, there's strain on our relationships, substance misuse may also occur. But importantly, there are also affirmative mental health outcomes. And this is something that's less captured in the literature, but really important for considering how do we adapt. And these affirmative mental health outcomes are often in a post-disaster setting when community members come together, they band together and they support one another. Again, being here in Barrie with the tornado that recently happened, in less than 24 hours, they had a full stop. They didn't need any more donations. And they didn't need any more financial donations the second day after the flood or the tornado had occurred. So really, when communities see that there's an issue and they can come together to support one another. An important thing to note, however, is that the experiences of grief and depression and loss can also co-occur with some of those affirmative mental health outcomes. So it's really complicated and complex. And of course, there's also the community health outcomes, which could lead to interpersonal aggression, increases in violence and crime, increased social instability, and decreased community cohesion. So these are also items that can occur as we experience our change in climate. And moving to our next slide. It's important to note too that it's not just related to specific climate hazards. For many of us, we may be experiencing the climate crisis from our awareness of the issue. You know, we're really attuned to the climate crisis and what's happening around our world, even if we may not be personally affected. And there's a whole host of new terminology. These terms here, they're not diagnosable disorders, so you're not going to find them in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual that mental health professionals use, but rather they're terms that researchers are using to describe how our understanding and awareness of climate change affects our overall well-being. So feeling things like climate or eco-anxiety, feeling really anxious and scared and feeling of impending doom related to climate change. Or ecological grief, you know, feeling the loss and lament for our current environmental surroundings or for the future environmental surroundings. Eco-paralysis is feeling like we can't do anything big enough to address the issue in the time that we need to. And similarly, eco-guilt is feeling like we are all perpetrators of the climate change problem. You know, we don't have, our lives aren't made in the domain of being really focused on climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So we all feel that we're contributing to the problem. And solastalgia is feeling a sense of being homesick in our home environment because our home environment is changing so drastically. And so when we look at, you know, well, how do we study this? That was my big question when I started my PhD, was that, you know, there wasn't a ton of research in this area. And, you know, there was a lot of communities that were doing climate change and health assessments, and mental health would have a brief mention. You know, it was very much overlooked in a lot of these climate change and health reports. So what I tried to do myself and my supervisor at U of T is we wanted to try and understand, you know, how is climate change and health being assessed, surveilled, and monitored in other domains, and how can we apply that in the mental health field? So we did a systematic scoping review. We looked at, or sorry, not a systematic scoping review, but a scoping review of the literature, and looked at all of the different types of climate hazards. So this is just one snapshot here. Who tends to be most at risk? So this is extreme weather events. Who tends to be most at risk? And it's often based on those who are already experiencing health inequities, as I mentioned. What are some of the potential mental health outcomes as described in the literature? And how have they been measured? So is it through surveys post-disaster? Is it looking at patient records or emergency department visits or new prescription drug use? That was a big issue when we see after the 2013 floods in southern Alberta, there was an increased prescription drug use for anti-anxiety and sleeping medications. And of course, interviewing people to ask them about their experiences. And as part of this research that I conducted as well, I not only wanted to understand, you know, what are the risks and hazards, but what are some of the factors that influence community well-being, and what happens when these things are missing? So what came up was that there was kind of these 11 factors. I'm sure there are many more, but this was the first stab at this kind of research. And a sense of community and social capital were so strongly related. One being a sense of community is like a feeling of belonging, and social capital are the actual networks. That came up as being very protective. Also, we want to have communities that are prepared. So communities that do vulnerability and adaptation assessments, but they also factor in mental health. We need to make sure that there's access to mental health care, both physical and financial, and that often requires government assistance, and also a lot of collaboration from different sectors. And then really making sure that there's an opportunity to enhance mental health literacy. So just as I mentioned earlier, looking at the continuum of mental health versus, you know, stigmatizing mental ill health. And making sure that healthcare providers are trained in the mental health impacts of climate change, and that the resources that are received are culturally relevant and culturally appropriate. And also finally, that when we're communicating about climate change, we're pairing the risks with the adaptation opportunities. And that's a really important thing, because people who are already alarmed about the climate crisis, when you're providing more of the risk factors without what people can do about it, it can push them into further anxiety or push people to just kind of deny or disavow the information that they're receiving and just feel like it's information overload. And finally, I'll end here because I know I'm out of time in 1 minute, this is just a compendium of some novel approaches to addressing the climate crisis. The book on the right by Sarah Jacket Ray is a wonderful field guide to climate anxiety. She is a college professor in the US, and she really writes this to kind of the 20, 30 something audiences. And it really provides a practical approach. There's a lot of humor and creativity and supporting people who might be experiencing climate anxiety and wanting to know what they can do about addressing the climate crisis. There's tons of networks of care. So increasingly, there's psychiatry alliances in the US and Canada and the UK that are addressing this. There's lots of different training opportunities, guidance materials. But some of the few things I really want to focus on is nature-based therapies. Spending time in nature, it not only creates a better relationship between humans and the environment, but it also creates a sense of respect, reciprocity, and allows us to understand that we're protecting the beautiful nature that surrounds us. And this also improves our mood. It reduces our stress hormones and allows us to get in touch with our nature, the natural environment. And then a few other different interventions. They're all hyperlinked here, so please feel free to share this slide deck, but there's some group-based interventions. Many of them are online, spiritual-based interventions, and then there's the online forums, particularly Eco-Anxious Stories provides a lot of really great resources. And I think I'm out of time, so I will stop there and look forward to the other presenters and the questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Katie. That was a very interesting presentation, and thank you for taking us through all of these kind of different aspects of, what is mental health and what can happen underneath it, and also talking about some of those helpful resources. We will share those slides with our audience. That can be very useful to everybody. So thank you so much for your presentation. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, who's Eleanor Rougeau. She has been a human rights advocate since a very young age, focusing on climate change justice since high school. She co-founded the group Fridays for Future Toronto, and with her co-organizers, she led the large youth climate strike in late 2019. She's a public speaker and a workshop leader, using these opportunities to raise awareness on the urgency of the climate crisis and discuss solutions that are available to us as a society and empower others to join the fight. She graduated from University of Toronto in June 2021 and now works in a not-for-profit organization where she advocates for climate justice and environmental protection. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pallavi, and thank you, Katie, for providing all this background. Hi, folks. Good evening. Very nice to be with you virtually today. I obviously come from a background not of actual research on climate anxiety, but probably much more from a very lived experience of anxiety or mental health around issues of sustainability. So today, and I'm going to try to keep my presentation quite short so that we can have time for questions, I really want to give you a quick overview of what I've heard or noticed in my activism and with other young folks that are organizing with me. Very quickly, Fridays for Future Toronto is the organization that is behind those big youth climate strikes, but we also do information campaigns, a lot of social media presence. We also put pressure on the private sector to avoid too much greenwashing. So we kind of have a wide range of tactics at this point, but we originate in this idea of the climate strikes. And we are all volunteers, which I think is relevant when we talk about mental capacity and activism, because a lot of this work is really unpaid. And so a lot of the times we have to take it upon ourselves to continue doing it. So I want to provide this background, not because I think it's an exhaustive list, but because I think sometimes folks know maybe more about the technical, anxiety or the eco grief, but don't think about all the other things that come into doing activism work in this space. So this is kind of want to flag. And I will add an element that we might want to discuss after. During the pandemic, we have seen a huge increase in young people joining our movement. I can't tell you why. The specific reasons are just not something I've actually studied, but I want to point that out. I think it'd be interesting for us to maybe discuss why afterwards, because it probably ties in nicely with what we're talking about today. But what I've noticed in terms of maybe if I had to find three big trends is that the first one is obviously this idea of eco-anxiety, eco-grief, and all this association of the sinking feeling we have of hearing about the climate crisis. And for me, for example, it's when I imagine waking up in a world where there's constant instability, where we can't predict anything. It's also having the stress of not knowing whether or not I could one day afford to be a parent, because I don't know if I want to be putting a child in a situation of distress. So, those kind of really emotional topics that tie directly to the catastrophe that climate change is. There's also a very common one in the circles I'm in, which is activism-related anxiety and burnout. These are really linked to the fact that we are activists, and so we're taking up this work of pushing for more progressive policies, for example. A few of those reasons are because we become public figures on topics. And when you're a young person, you become a public figure, especially if you're also at the intersection of other identities, you're a person of color, you're a woman, you might have a visible disability. You're also targeted much more by groups that are trying to oppose climate action. People will make it personal. So that kind of adds to it. We're often quite young and we get responsibilities quite young. When we organize a strike, I deal with the police, I deal with the security of City Hall. And so we have responsibilities. And so those also adds to the mental health issues. And then there are ones that are common across non-youth volunteers as well that do this work is the financial strain. When it's not paid, you're taking time off work or other things to do this work. And the big issue of thinking that we have to solve for ourselves the whole problems. It's really hard for me to say no to a project. And I know that's a reality for a lot of folks. So this is what I call the activism anxiety. And then the last one is what I've named, and it's not a technical term, the generational anxiety. And it's when you realize that there is a gap between many other generations and the youth that are often the youth asking for climate action. And this gap feels even worse when you realize that not only is there a generational gap in understanding of the problem, there's a generational gap in who has the money, the power, and the decision-making opportunities. And so a few examples of where this generational gap manifests is school programs. We want to talk, whether it's university or younger, we want to talk about these topics. We want to talk about climate change. We want to talk about new economic thinking. We want to talk about the tools that are going to help us deal with it. And a lot of the times we're told, not yet, not now, this is not the class for it. And so that gap is often quite felt by youth. The other one, it is a very strongly felt one, is when we're told, you give us hope. And probably you've heard a lot of people say that about youth climate activists. And if you're a young person yourself, you've been told, you give me hope. We never want to hear that we give others hope if that's the only statement, because what we hear is, I'm going to let you do the work. I'm passing on the burden to you. And I'm no longer in this fight because you're giving me hope, you're giving me optimism, and you're taking care of this. So very important. And I'm flagging this as well. If you are more of an older adult, I would say, and you're speaking to youth in this sphere, of being mindful of what you say, because you don't want to add to the mental health toll that this kind of work is taking on us. So I'll try to wrap it up here, but briefly, I also want to flag that for some folks that I organize with, there is an additional layer, which is that they come from, it could be indigenous communities, it can be racialized communities, it could be they are migrants, and so their family is in the global south, for example. And that might be the case for many of you as well, is you're not you might not be directly at risk, but close ones or people that you're close to are actually directly at risk and due to the climate crisis. And so that usually adds to the distress that I see in our organizing circles, is when young people, they're hearing about the floods, but it's floods back home in a community that's dear to them. So I really look forward to the discussion, and I hope we can discuss maybe the solutions that I've identified for myself to overcome these. I've seen other young people identify. I would love to leave us off on a more hopeful and positive note, but I hope that this kind of helps you get some context on the issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. You introduced a lot of, interesting dimensions into this conversation that I think is, will be very good to have further discussions on, especially like the intersectionality and the generational kind of gap in this. So thank you for introducing those aspects, and let's discuss them. But first, we will go to our next speaker, Florence Williams, who is a journalist, author, and podcaster. She's a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times, New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, the New York Review of Books, Slate, Mother Jones, and numerous other publications. A fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature and a visiting scholar at George Washington University, her work focuses on the environment, health, and science. Her most recent book, The Nature Fix, was an Audible bestseller and was named a top summer read by JP Morgan. Florence was named Author of the Week by The Week in May 2012. The Wall Street Journal calls her writing droll and crisp, which makes her feel like a pastry. Florence, please discuss with us, your work and the impact that nature can have on our mental health. Over to you.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you so much for having me. I think this is a really interesting and important forum. And I think that Ali and Katie summarized, the issues very well that we're dealing with. I guess I'm here to talk about a little bit of the good news, which is, stress is inevitable. How we respond to stress is really more of a choice. And fortunately, as Katie mentioned, we do have a lot of tools to do that. I was really happy to see forest bathing as one of them. I've been writing about nature's influence on mental health for a number of years. I've been writing about environmental issues for a long, long time. It's not just the younger generation that has been really deeply concerned with the fate of our planet. I will put in a plug for Generation X. We've really been, fighting the good fight for conservation and biodiversity for a long, long time, and also very concerned about it. But I also think that, my generation maybe is a little more connected to nature, sort of grew up a little bit more connected to nature. Although certainly we are still quite disconnected and have been for a couple of generations. But I started writing about these issues because we live in an increasingly urban society. And it's not just that we are disconnected, but we've actually sort of forgotten that we are even a part of nature. We've lost that sense of reciprocity. And how to sort of learning how to kind of renew our cups, if you will, from these stresses and the activism that we all, need to keep doing. So I started writing about the science that is showing, in fact, that when we spend time in beautiful nature spaces, our blood pressure drops, our stress hormones drop, our respiration slows, our prefrontal cortex dims down. And we can see this in brain studies. We can see it in MRIs. We know that different parts of our brain come online when we are in a sensory space. So when we can hear the birds, when we can feel the breeze on our faces, when we can sort of move through natural landscapes, some really amazing things happen to our sense of time, to our sense of community. When we experience the beauty of awe, for example, we feel that our own personal problems become a little bit less important. We feel more connected to the world around us. And in fact, we feel more connected to our communities. So I am one of these people who argues that wilderness is actually critical for civilization. If we were going to solve these tough problems from a community standpoint and take care of each other, we need to feel like our personal problems and our personal stresses are sort of in the background, and that we feel connected to each other. So it's not just now that we are living in more increasingly urban environments, but as Ali mentioned, we are faced with these crises that keep blowing up. We see the landscape on fire. We see the floods. We see the tornadoes increasingly. We see the loss of biodiversity. We have a pandemic. We have Black Lives Matter and increasing anxiety over sort of racial injustice and social injustice. So I like to think of nature as a critical element in how to recover so that we can keep moving forward. And a term that I've actually really come to like is the notion of urgent biophilia. So biophilia, being the idea that we are deeply evolved to have an affinity for other living things. We care for them innately. We are wired to care for the non-human world. And sometimes in times of crisis and when we're recovering from disaster, that need becomes really, really critical and urgent. So, for example, after the tornado that struck Joplin, Missouri in 2011, the community came together to replant thousands of trees. It was a very healing process, not just for them kind of individually and spiritually, but collectively for the community to come together. And so I would argue that just like we need to think about stockpiling hospital beds and ICU beds and masks and ventilators, our cities need to start thinking about stockpiling nature. We need to have parks. We need to have big parks. We need to have parks that are accessible to different neighborhoods, to all people. Right now, there's a great sort of inequity in who has access to large parks. And in a time of a pandemic, we need large parks, not just small parks. So I think that this is a question for our institutions and for our communities and for our urban planners. And that's a good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. And thanks for taking us through how being in green spaces is so crucial to our well-being. That was really interesting to learn about kind of the changes in your brain and just being out in nature. I will think about that more every time I'm in nature. I do, and I'm sure people, others here as well have felt it. It just feels really different when you're out in nature and hearing birds chirp. Or recently I've been really just amazed by the amount of fireflies that are there after dark in any green space. And I feel like that does bring me joy and impacts my mental health. So thank you to all the panelists for introducing their work and sharing these very interesting aspects with us. So for the next piece of this, I would ask all panelists to put their videos on, and we'll have a bit of a panel discussion on a few questions and delve deeper into this topic of mental health a bit more. CP Ottawa is essentially an organization that brings together environmental practitioners together. And we often want to learn from our panelists how they started their careers and got to where they are. We'll take a bit of a sidestep from the heavy topic of mental health and maybe try to learn a bit more about our panelists. Tell us a bit about your careers in sustainability and how you got there. Any any turning points in there, or things that inspired you and motivated you to do the work you do. And I'll invite Katie to start, then go to Ali, and then to Florence.
Sure. Well, to start off, it was not a linear path for me. It was a long and winding road with many weird stops along the way. So my job right now, I'm actually a senior policy analyst at Health Canada's Climate Change and Innovation Bureau, but I'm not speaking on their behalf, but that's my role currently. And how I got into this again, my undergrad was really focused on looking at social inequities and really looking at racialization and less focused on the environment. And then I spent a few years teaching and then went to and did my master's where I looked at environmental sustainability in a Chinese context. So I lived briefly in China and did some research there looking at Chinese perspectives of environmental sustainability, and wrote a thesis about that, and started working for an environmental consulting firm doing communications, because my master's was in international communications. And it struck me while I was there that we were working in an environmental consulting firm. They were really focused on, the social aspect, the financial aspect, and the environmental aspect, and completely overlooked health. I was like, isn't health everywhere in everything we do? If you work in the transportation sector, doesn't that affect our health? And working on climate change topics, but health was missing. And so I went back to school and did my PhD at U of T, and knew that my research was going to focus on climate change impacts to health, because that was defining issue at the time. And as I was working with my supervisor, all of the reports I was reading, I was getting so much anxiety and grief. We looked into the research and we go, there's not a ton of research on climate change and mental health. Like, why is there this big gap? And if you're feeling it, so many other people have to be feeling like this. And we really, latched on to that. And then also really didn't want to focus only on the problem area, just identifying the problem area. That doesn't really do anyone any good. We know it affects our mental health, but what can we do about it? What are the ways that we can support our mental health and well-being? That was what I was really excited about, because I wasn't going to make it through a PhD focused only on the problem, right? And so while I was working on my PhD, I joined the Government of Canada as a research affiliate. And I didn't know at the time that they had a Climate Change and Innovation Bureau. Most people don't know that it exists. We don't have a great web presence. And it was through a friend of a friend that worked there that I met my mentor, who I'd read all of his stuff on climate change and health, and really got brought in. And I'm, really excited right now. My job is basically helping health authorities across the country who are working on climate change and health projects. And for me, that's really exciting. And it's really focused on adaptation. Again, not just identifying the problem area, but what are we doing about it? And our mandate is to build resilience against climate change for all of Canadians. So for me, that's really exciting. And on the side hustle, I do a lot of presentations about climate change and mental health, and meet wonderful presenters as well. So that's been really exciting for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Ali, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll share almost two stories. The first one is kind of my path to activism, because I think I'm 22, so my career hasn't been super long yet. I just graduated 2 months ago, but I will share the beginning of my career because it is in sustainability. So getting to activism for me was a very progressive movement and experience, because I just started as a young person being concerned. And that was really the starting point, was not me wanting to be in any leadership position. It wasn't from a desire of creating something or founding something. I was concerned. I was 10 years old. I was reading about biodiversity loss, and I was appalled by the fact that it was happening. And that was it. And I started speaking up. And I realized that people were kind of listening to me. They were saying, well, do you want to speak to the whole class instead? Or do you want to speak to the school library and give a presentation there? And so just progressively like this, I started just getting more and more comfortable with the idea of advocacy and the fact that you can actually, when you care about something, try to get others to also care about it. And it's not something strange or weird that you would be doing. And from there, I got connected to more and more movements, the human rights movement, specifically women's rights issues and refugee rights, because I live near the Mediterranean and we have a massive issue of how we treat refugees there. And again, in those spaces, I was learning about the fact that there were whole organizations around advocacy, and I really discovered the world of advocacy through there. And even though I was doing so in a volunteer position, I think folks need to also think of that when they think about careers in sustainability, is these are real careers in sustainability, the advocacy part, and you don't have to be necessarily either in the government or the private sector. There is an entire career to be had in advocacy. But that wasn't me at the time. I was still in high school, really. And then I moved to university. I decided to study public policy and economics at U of T. And that was really almost a petty move on my part. It's because I initially thought I was going to study environmental engineering. And then when I realized that we have a lot of the solutions already, or we have a lot of smart people already in those domains, but we didn't have that many well-spoken folks who were willing to kind of do the work of linking the economy, economics, the market, and this idea of government, and then these like human rights values, this kind of the more almost like philosophical aspect of why do we care intrinsically about nature outside of it. And so I thought, well, these are things that I'm just going to try to link together. And so it was really after being told 1,000 times it's not economically feasible that I started to take economics, just to kind of prove folks wrong. And so, yeah, I had that progress. And at the same time, I started doing work with Fridays for Future Toronto. I created it, and then we started hosting the climate strikes. And just for the anecdote there, what enabled me to do it was the fact that I had other folks that said, I don't want to be a lead on this. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm willing to support you no matter what you do. And I think Katie kind of highlighted the importance of having sometimes at the right time someone to lend you a hand. And for me, that was also the case in activism, was someone giving me full support at the right time. And so just kind of through Fridays for Future, we grew as a group. We made a lot of noise until we really got noticed. And I also kind of ended up becoming more of someone doing workshops and public speaking, but that was really on the side of organizing. And then to tie it all up with the career aspect, I thought, okay, I'm going to take all of this, but then I'm going to work in the private sector. And that was a conviction of mine because I had started in economics with the idea of then bridging the gap between those things. So I thought I have to go in the private sector. And so I attended a lot of events with private sector professionals in sustainability. And there were some very interesting people, very passionate people, and excellent people. But what I kept going back to is the work I'm best at is at the end of is taking what we know on climate and advocating for us to apply the common sense knowledge to our policies and to our economy. And so I ended up applying to one position in the NGO world. I applied to a lot in the sustainability, the private sector sustainability, and then one in the NGO world, which was at environmental defense. And I ended up getting the job and looking at all the other offers and thinking, no, this is the one I want to do, even though it's not the one I thought. It's not maybe the most glamorous one. It's the path that my parents said, you can't be a career activist. What is that? But it is the one I took on, and it's the role I've done for 2 months now. And it is a path that I'm happy to speak more about it if folks are interested, but it's been very, very fulfilling. And again, it's really been about following that instinct that you have between what you're good at, what you know you like, and what's obviously offered to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, you're very right? You have to balance all those three things, and it's great that you're in a position that's rewarding to you and kind of brings all those aspects together of what you want to do and what you're good at. So that's really good to hear, and congrats on the new position. Now let's move on to Florence. Florence, you're very accomplished and have written about your work and published author. So tell us a bit more how you got into it.
Sure, I'll just be really brief. I have been interested in journalism for a long time, the ability the power really of storytelling to affect change and to move people. I think we can't solve a lot of these problems unless we can appeal to people's emotions. And storytelling, I think, is really critical for that. And so I started working for an environmental sort of newspaper / magazine right out of college. And I think, like Katie, at some point I was like, well, where are the people in this equation? And I had a daughter. I gave birth. I was nursing her, and I read a scientific paper talking about toxic chemicals in breast milk. And I thought, that's super fascinating. What does that mean? What does that mean for her? What does that mean for breast cancer? And I actually decided to tell, I decided that a powerful way to tell that story would be through the first person. So I actually sent my breast milk to a lab in Germany, which at the time was one of the few places in the world that could detect some of these small amounts of industrial chemicals. And we were looking for pesticides and flame retardants and jet fuel ingredients. And I ended up writing that for the New York Times Magazine, and it went viral. So that was a lesson for me, in that people are interested in environmental issues, especially, I think, when you can sort of bring it home to what this means for their families. And that first person storytelling is a powerful way to do it, especially if you're talking about science. And I got a fellowship after that to learn more of the science, which I had kind of avoided in college. So things like, cell biology and endocrinology and sort of ways to talk about science. And I've been sort of off to the races ever since. And I tell stories through books and through podcasts now, which I think are really important for reaching younger audiences, and also still through magazine stories.
Thank you, Florence, for sharing that story. That's a very kind of interesting, personal storytelling piece, and your foray into this sector. The three of you have such kind of different paths to here, and it's very interesting to kind of hear about that. And something that's that I've heard from all three of your talk is kind of the concern and that led you to doing this work. So my question is, so one can actually, argue that that little bit of anxiety is actually required to bring action. If people are not concerned, they won't demand change. So what are your thoughts on this? And we'll start with Katie on this question. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I get this question a lot, and it's important to frame, like, anxiety is not inherently bad, right? Like, anxiety is part of our brain chemistry that tells us that there's a warning signal, right? That we need to do something about it. So it's not an inherent pathology. Yes, you can have generalized anxiety disorder. There are definitely some mental health issues with anxiety, but yeah, it triggers our concern to do something, to act in some way. So I recently did some research with a program called Earth Rangers, which is a school-based program that goes into schools, and it helps children get in touch with the natural environment. They have an app and they have games that you can do, and it's all free, et cetera. And we did some research on eco-anxiety and eco-action. And what we found was that, yeah, of course, the kids who sign up for Earth Rangers have a bit more anxiety. They're concerned about it, and they're doing something about it, right? They're wanting to learn more. They're talking to their parents about the environment and what it means to them. And that was the interesting thing, is that this eco-anxiety and bringing this to the table and talking to their parents actually encouraged their parents to do something about it. So it's called the pass-through effect. And there's been other research on this as well, is that, to really mobilize some action, having children who are passionate about this, who are doing something about this, it gets the whole family involved. And so, in my mind, having some level of anxiety isn't inherently bad, but to Ali's point earlier as well, it's something to moderate, particularly moderating burnout, right? Because our anxiety and our push to do something can push us towards overexerting ourselves and not filling up our own cup. And so it's really being cognizant of where that line is, and it's going to be different for everyone, right? So often in my presentations, I have one slide that says, is action the antidote to anxiety? And I always caution, I say, it is an antidote. It is not the antidote, because for people who are already experiencing anxiety. They may have other things going on in their life. They're experiencing health inequities. They may be experiencing other mental health issues. Asking someone in that state to do more is going to push someone to burnout, right? Into a state where it's going to lead to negative health effects. So it's really important. There's no one size fits all to our eco-anxiety and our eco-grief. It's really important to understand our own level of well-being, what supports us, what are some of our coping mechanisms, and what we're going to need as ourselves and as our community to create that wellness. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Allie, do you want to talk on this?
Sure, very briefly. I think the simple answer is yes, of course it's necessary. I mean, I told you my story is starting to act out of concern. Of course, if I hadn't had an anxiety, I would probably still, I don't know what I would be doing really, but not speaking here. But I don't think we should frame this thinking, okay, then why are we even talking about this whole mental health thing? What I'm trying to eliminate personally is not anxiety about climate change. It's climate change. And so I think, we just in asking this question, I wouldn't want to give the idea that, yes, it is kind of good for climate action. And so we should kind of fuel it. The problem is that we, as citizens, even have to take climate action because the systems in place don't actually address concerns. So I just maybe that would be my only answer, is reframing that, yes, of course we need it, but it is sad that we need it in the first place. And it's sad that we even need to be prompted into action in the first place.
Yeah, an excellent point. Thanks for that. Florence.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think that, we tend to think that, as Katie mentioned, that stress is bad, but, cortisol, which we often call sort of a stress hormone, we need a little high bump of it, at dawn, or we wouldn't even get out of bed, so it's actually a very motivating hormone, neurotransmitter. We need these. I guess just to put this in sort of deep evolutionary perspective, we are all meant to have, this kind of motivational, what we call stress. And I think we have a tendency to sort of be nostalgic about, our hunting and gathering past, or our non-urban past. And, oh, life was so great, when we lived in the woods. But that's, of course, there were huge stresses, in our deep early human, ancestors. But I do think there's an important sort of distinction, which is that those kinds of bursts of acute stress are meant to be alleviated, and our bodies are meant to rebound from stress. And we used to have all these great ways of doing it. So, we used to watch the sunset, and we used to hang out together by the fire and sing and dance and tell stories. So yeah, we might get chased by a saber tooth, but then, we could like walk it off and shake it off and sing it off and dance it off. And in our modern lives, we don't have those same kinds of options. We have Netflix, and we have, online shopping, and we have ice cream. And it's just not the same, and it's not enough. And so we need to figure out how to sort of access those things that really make us feel more whole and more together.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a very, useful distinction to make between the motivational stress and the anxiety that's causing burnout, and what we can do about it. So actually this delves in quite nicely with the next question, which I'll direct to Florence. So Allie mentioned this as well. There's this biodiversity loss that we have ongoing, and also the access to green space is reducing more and more, which has adverse effects for mental health. And interestingly enough, one of the things that helps with mental health issues is being in the green space. So what are your thoughts on this kind of vicious circle of biodiversity loss and loss of green space adversely affecting our mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways that is the great tragedy of our modern humanity. We have depleted, this source of regeneration, and we've kind of handcuffed our own ability, to to solve it, right? Because we are in this cycle of kind of stress and anxiety about it. So I think, I am really passionate about getting kids connected to nature and getting kids outside. And I feel like that's almost where you have to start, right? Because their parents are not necessarily connected to nature, and the kids naturally want to be out there. They naturally want to be climbing trees and, throwing rocks around and running around. And I think if we can instill a sort of love, like a deep love, tap into that, then there is hope that those children will grow up to care about nature, but also to know how to soothe themselves and comfort themselves and renew themselves as they fight these fights.
Thanks. That's a very interesting point. Ali or Katie, feel free to kind of opine on this kind of challenge of losing our green spaces and that impacting our mental health as well.
Yeah, maybe I can just share a few teachings that I've been lucky to hear from folks. Obviously, ever since I moved to Canada, one great source of knowledge I've been finding is through Indigenous elders. I'm not Indigenous myself, but it's just been through the movement, folks I've been able to connect to. And when I hear this, I can think of two folks that have helped me reconcile the need for nature and the fact that I lived in downtown Toronto on campus at that time when I was feeling so much anxiety. And the first person is Carolyn Crawley, and she does urban forest walks, and she guides people, even people that work on Bay Street, and in the financial district. And she goes through cities and spaces that look so urban, and you think there's no way there's even life here. And she points out every little bit of biodiversity, and she tells you, learn about the biodiversity that is around you. Yeah, it's not like the beautiful forest that Florence has behind her in her background, but you know what? You start noticing. And she kind of scolded me one time when I came in with earphones. She was like, "You're missing all the birds." I was saying, "Well, yeah, but I'm also missing all the cars passing by." But she was saying you have to kind of pick, and if you're able to tune in, you can kind of also force yourself to find that. And the second person I thought of was Isaac Crosby, who's also Indigenous, and he suggested we grow actual food inside our homes and not just plants. He actually told me that because we were thinking about how we can save energy when we grow food in the winter. But he said it's really a great joy to have a cucumber growing in your living room, and then tomatoes somewhere or whatever it is. But that ends up bringing back some of nature in your homes directly, and you do save energy because you're heating your home anyway. So you might as well grow foods. But yeah, these are two tricks that I've been told.
Yeah, those are excellent. Thanks so much. What about you, Katie? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important, just as, Florence and Ali were mentioning, spending time in nature is critical, and particularly for children. And, what we're also learning with the climate crisis is also listening to our children's emotions, because they're seeing changes happening a lot quicker. And so they're going to experience the grief, the loss of some of their natural environment. So it's really about learning to connect their love and respect for nature with their emotional well-being as well, and helping them to have those conversations. Because I think as adults, we forget to have that, sometimes when I talk about eco-grief to people, and my parents are older, they're like, really, is that a thing? And I want to scream at them and be like, yes, it is a thing, and I experience it on a daily. But it's really about creating those connections and that understanding and that openness to have the dialogue about what it means to us as humans, so that it creates more of that reciprocity, and we don't see it as constantly other. Again, in thinking about what Ali's mentioning about Indigenous ways of knowing, really seeing us as part of all of this, and how we have to have this much more respectful and nurturing relationship. So I think that that's kind of an important piece to consider.
Thanks. Yeah, that's actually a very excellent point, that we need to see ourselves as part of nature and not something separate from it. And growing food in the living room should be completely normal and accepted practice, but it's not. And so we're a little short on time because I want to go to questions, but I will ask you all one last question, and I'll start with Katie. So what do you think we can do to bring about change, and what can specifically youth do?
It's not an easy question. There's so many things. Anything within your power and within your emotional tolerance at the time. Honestly, anything, any one act. For people who are really struggling, like living through this pandemic, dealing with climate change, and all of our other life stuff that happens for, it's hard. And sometimes doing that one thing becomes that one thing that brings us a little spark of joy or a little spark of feeling like you're contributing to something that's going to better. So, whether that's, taking active transportation instead of, driving or flying, or whether that's engaging in some form of activism, if that's your jam, go for it, or arts-based approaches. Also, there's a lot of ways of creating community, having these conversations with other people and opening up the dialogue. That's a part of action that needs to take shape. So for me, it's really anything and everything that you can do, not prescriptive. I'm not saying you should do one thing and not do another, because again, eco-guilt is alive and well, and so is eco-paralysis. But finding one thing that works for you and trying to commit to that can be helpful for your overall well-being. Thanks.
Thanks. Ali?
Sure, I think this is going to be a yes and, because I can only agree with what Katie said. I'll add to that what I've seen, especially for youth, maybe because those are the folks I work with the most. What I've seen be useful is identify for yourself where you are the most relevant, legitimate, and trusted voice, because first of all, you'll have a bigger impact. So if you start doing an action, I'm always kind of, systems oriented and say, like, start asking for changes in policy, but it can be also an individual lifestyle change. You start doing it and you feel like no one's seeing it, or maybe people are judging it, or people are not understanding it. You might feel worse about yourself than you did before. But if you start doing it in the area that you already know you're a respected person, and that could be at your dinner table, that could be in your school, in your, your sports club, or whatever it is, really anywhere, your workplace, then you'll first of all feel better about yourself and feel understood, but also you'll see that you'll actually be imitated and you'll actually activate others. And I think, to me, that's been the most rewarding thing, is seeing that I can activate others, not by scolding them, not by forcing them, but just they see my passion and they jump onto it as well. And I think that will trigger change and make you also feel empowered. So I would recommend trying that.
Thanks. Florence, what can we do to bring change?
Yes, and again, I think there's so much variation. There's so much individual variation in what our strengths are, what we can contribute, and also how we recover and how we feel good. And so I do think that in modern life, we're not so good at feeling embodied and knowing what makes us feel good. And that's actually one thing that being in nature can really help us do. We can sort of become our sensory animal beings a little bit better. And when we can do that, we can be a little more present and a little more mindful and pay attention to, what we need emotionally, and also what we can contribute to others. And I think that, people talk about how we live in sort of an age of loneliness, not just from each other in our societies, but now we're living in an age of sort of ecological loneliness as well. And one of the, we're talking about antidotes, one of the antidotes to loneliness, ironically, it's not necessarily togetherness, it's purpose and mission. And sometimes that does have the side effect of bringing us together. So.
Thank you so much. So I see a lot of questions popping up and some hands raised as well. So I will start with a question, and it's open to all the panelists, do you think that the pandemic will change anything when it comes to mental health and the environment?
I'm going to start quickly. One of the things in terms of accessibility of mental health care. So with the pandemic, we're a lot more open talking about our mental health, right? When you talk to someone, when you say, how are you? You don't always get the good. You get the, I'm pulling my hair out, my kids are driving me nuts, like I can't do this anymore. When do we get to travel? All of these things. So we're a lot more open to talking about our mental health needs. And there's been the creation of a lot more mental health resources that are freely accessible. The challenge, however, that we're not looking at is that many of these mental health resources are not entirely accessible to all populations. People in rural and remote communities, Indigenous communities that don't have internet that is really reliable. We're seeing a lot more mental health care that's online that creates access, but there is still some challenges to it. But I also think that recognizing that a large public health threats affect our mental health, COVID, climate change, these things have not only individual mental health components, but collective community mental health components. I think it's a bit of an awakening to that as well.
Yeah, I think this question, it's difficult. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking it could be approached at many sides, but one element for me is I've heard a lot of folks that have felt with COVID much more tired of hearing of another crisis right after. And I think that probably comes from just mental health, which is your capacity drained. Interestingly enough, it reinforces the difficulty of those who do care deeply about the issue despite. And so they're thinking, oh, you don't want to hear about it, but it still concerns me. And others are thinking, I don't want to hear more about a crisis. I've just been through so much of a crisis. So yeah, I do think the pandemic has largely influenced and changed things. At the same time, I'm hoping, and this is me speaking into existence, that also we will value more right after the things that made us feel good and prompted us into action. And obviously what I do is climate strikes, and climate strikes is large bodies of people coming together and singing and chanting to demand action. And so I'm also hoping that that will kind of change, that this pandemic will change how people perceive these kind of events, not only as protests, but also opportunities to collectively mobilize, because now we value collectives so much more. So maybe the flip side is hopefully we're going to have good outcomes like that after.
Yeah.
I think that after a huge crisis like this, there's sort of two directions that societies tend to go, and one is towards more autocracy and less personal freedom, and the other is towards like a deeper progressive change. And so I think it's a little too early to tell. I'm a little worried here in the United States. But I will also say that from my perch here, having written a lot about people finding solace and grace in the natural landscape, that I'm seeing more of it than ever. Being outside was kind of one of the only places people actually felt safe. And so the silver lining here is that, people are outside, they're taking their kids outside. Their kids are actually learning that being outside is really great. And their parents are learning outside is really great. And people know that they're spending too much time, on Zoom, and that they need a break from it. My trails, in my neighborhood are packed. People are out there, and people are discovering, they're actually noticing that they need to feel better and that nature helps them get there. And those are like really beautiful to see.
Thanks. Yeah, excellent. I think excellent answers. And I think whoever asked the question, I think it's answered. So I see Elaine has her hand up. Elaine, do you want to ask a question? I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, but I have asked you to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my comment than anything. When the question was asked of what can we do, I just kind of jumped in thinking there's something I did recently. I'm in Ottawa, Canada, and before the fires in the West, I wrote a letter to our Prime Minister, a handwritten letter, and I just asked him to, take action fast and quickly, and to get Canadians on board. It's now or never. So I just thought I would just share that with you in case anyone else wants to write letters, be it to look at Carney in Canada, or Catherine McKenna, who's recently left the Liberal Party.
Yeah, it's hard to hear you, Lynn. You're cutting out there. But if I understand the gist of it, you're talking about writing to the Prime Minister or elected representatives as a action on climate change.
Correct. Yeah. As well, I just also added that Mark Carney, who's also has really taken quite a lead in the environment, as well as Catherine McKenna, who recently left the Liberal Party. So those are other key people in Canada that seem to be stepping up for the environment and the climate crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely a great idea. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, is talking to elected representatives, telling them that we want that change, and hopefully they'll listen to us. So
Exactly. Thank you.
yeah. Thanks so much. Okay, so let's go on to the next question, which is Amanda's asking. So as environmental professionals, we understand the importance of connecting with nature for our well-being. But how can we accelerate the general population to get back, to the roots and getting into nature and take action to protect it? She also wants Eleanor to specifically opine on how we can create more advocates. So Ali, do you want to start?
I can give this a try. How to create more advocates is really what I'm wondering every day. A few approaches. The first one is meeting people where they're at. This is kind of the reality in every domain and whatever you do, really, but it is also true here. Instead of right away thinking, you see, right away you identified your willingness was, let's get people back to the roots for them to care. I think you would even take a step back and say, is that what every person needs, and is that what every person is capable of? So really meeting people where they're at. And when it's youth, it's probably they already want to be advocates and they just haven't been told that it's legitimate for them to do that, or they haven't been given the avenue. On the other side, a lot of moms come to me, specifically parents, but it's often moms come to me and say, I obviously care. I really just don't have time, right? I have a job, children, and many other things to take care of. And so for them, it's giving them the very practical things, or maybe relieving them of that burden that they have to add something to their schedule and telling them this is how you can incorporate it in your schedule. So when you take care of your child, you can be a climate advocate. When you go to work, you can be a climate advocate, etc. So sadly, I can't have a universal rule of how to create an activist. Otherwise, I would have many. But I think it's perhaps you can first choose a group of folks, probably the folks that you know best or that are most likely you, because you can kind of find out what they want and think for them specifically, what can we do for them to bring them there? But I'm sure Katie and Florence, you may have more clear insights on that.
Yep, thanks. This actually reminds me of some research that I have done, which is on how to get people to adopt more renewable energy, which is it's very interesting research on how motivation leads to action, which is if people see other people do things, that leads to action. And if people hear other people make plans to do things, that also leads to more action. So just kind of your line of thought triggered this in my head, so I thought I'd share that with people. Essentially, making the social norms change to make environmental activism the thing I think would be really helpful. But let's hear from Florence. What are your thoughts on this? How can we get more people to take action and to be more in nature?
I think I'm just a little bit of a broken record on this point, but I just think we really need to encourage people to connect to each other through storytelling, and also to the natural world. And it should start young. And we need to advocate for our communities to increase access to nature spaces. We need to improve the quality of nature in our cities, and we need our institutions, like the medical community, to take this on and to teach that nature is a tool for healing. And I see in the United States, we have, I think, 73 medical practices are prescribing nature as a way to sort of prevent and treat depression and anxiety. And I'd love to see more of that.
Okay, so this actually goes well with what we can ask Katie. Katie, can we expect Health Canada to be more prescriptive of nature?
I was just going to say, I can't add anything more than what you've all added. Those are exactly what Ali was saying. Meet people where they're at. Yes, social prescribing, environmental prescribing, and creating social norms. Particularly the prescribing piece, I think that is such an important perspective, and a really important perspective to hear from a medical practitioner. Anyone in the medical health field, they're seen as trusted folks. And so when you hear about what you can do from a trusted messenger, like someone in the health field, that is a key message, and that will help to create those types of really supportive things for us, instead of taking different prescriptive medications or whatever it is, but actually, take 2 hikes and call me in the morning. That's a great approach to really dealing with many of our anxieties. So for me, it's really just the prescribing of vitamin N, nature, is something that I think is really keen. So yeah, nothing more to add than what's already been said. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next question that I think we'll go to is from Stephen, who wants to know if, in your experience, have you used different approaches to reach out to different group stakeholders to buy into this? Goes back to, Ali mentioning the kind of intersectionality. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely. If you spoke to everybody the way I speak to the very young folks that I do workshops with, they would think I'm insulting them, and vice versa. So absolutely. To give more examples, obviously there's who people are. And so when I go speak to workers that are in carbon intensive industries, I don't exactly have the same language than when I speak to folks that are already in renewables, for example. But then also where people are at in terms of their relationship to the topic itself. So it's quite easy to speak to people and reach out to people that are already looking for ways to get into activism, and that you can really speak to them and reach out for making them become activists. But a lot of the times you should be wary of kind of wanting to move everybody towards that very extreme goal right away. And so we often kind of use this like continuum of engagement as a first tool in any course about how to engage people, because it's showing that there's some people that are perhaps so far away in terms of wanting to take action or wanting to care that you can't right away reach out to them with that purpose. You have to reach out to them, first of all, with your purpose of understanding them, and then your purpose of going with them to a next step. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. You have to use different strategies.
Thanks. Florence.
I actually think I'll let Katie maybe take this one. I think I've kind of said what I want to say about that.
Okay, sounds good. Katie, how about you?
It's going to be, again, meeting people where they're at. I mean, my approach is we really work with a lot of health professionals in public health. And so people in public health are working on a variety of different things already: opioid crisis, pandemic, major diseases that are within their city, county, country. And so when you say, oh, now can you also deal with climate change and health? They're like, whoa, I'm taxed out. So it's really finding the intersections of where climate comes in. If we're looking at maternal health, we know that climate change affects not only the person bearing the child, but also the fetus. And so we know that we need to have these conversations about bringing in climate change to all facets of health, and not adding things to people's plates, but also trying to describe where adaptations that are being taken or mitigations that are being taken that can protect health more generally. So I think that that's where we often kind of approach the subject from, is what are you already doing in the public health field, and how can we also talk to you about how this is a climate adaptation that you might not even be considering.
Yeah, that's a great point for kind of the perspective of public health in this, and very important aspect to consider. So we don't have a lot of time left, and I know, Katie, you wanted to leave a bit earlier. So I'm actually going to ask one question that I had that was separate from the panel discussion, because I asked you questions there as well. It's 2 questions actually. So interestingly enough, this panel is all women. Do you think that, and maybe from your own experiences, can you opine on whether there's just like more women in this movement right now? That's personally my experience in working kind of at grassroots on environmental activism, or even on the mental health perspective, that there are just more women taking action. Have you seen that too? Why do you think that's so? And how can we bring more men into this?
I can give this a try. It's a difficult one. I've definitely not done research on this, so it's going to be just my intuition. But first of all, yes, I've seen way more women or folks identifying as women in the spheres around me. But I'm wary of taking conclusions. It could be very easy, and I've heard many times that, well, women just are more nurturing and they care more, and perhaps that's the answer. I really don't know, but I also want to flag on another note that for now in the environmental movement, we would see more white folks, and that isn't the symptom that white folks care more. Actually, research shows that people of color care more, and so maybe I'm thinking perhaps in a similar manner, it could be the case. Really, again, intuition here, that men have other ways of engaging in these topics that either we haven't found yet, they haven't found yet, or we haven't highlighted. So I'll give a very anecdotal example of speaking to my younger brother. Why don't you join Fridays for Future? I mean, perfect profile, you're a high schooler, what are you going to do about this? And he said, well, I'm just not very interested in having these long conversations and blah blah. And I said, would you tape yourself to a subway to block for climate action? He said, yeah, that sounds more thrilling. And so again, I realized that my long meetings didn't sound great to him, but as a teenage boy, he did care a little more about the adrenaline for a cause. And so yeah, just to kind of point out that, not to draw conclusions too fast about why that is the case, but I do think it is the case in what I've seen.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, yeah, not kind of very anecdotal on my part as well, from my own experiences. So wanted to discuss it with this all-women panel and what they felt about it and some thoughts on it. Who wants to go next? Florence, Katie?
I can also kind of flip it on its head a bit, but yeah, same with what Ali sees is that in my field, especially mental health and climate change researchers, it's predominantly people who identify as female, and it's something I have noticed, and also in the office that I work for, it is predominantly people who identify as female. But more specifically, some of the research I've done is actually looking at impacts, so climate impacts on mental health. And what we always caution is that the research does show that women tend to self-report more about their mental health needs related to climate change, but that does not mean men don't experience it. They're socialized to talk more about their feelings and their well-being, whereas men are socialized to be a bit more stoic. And so what we always say is that, these are self-report surveys, so you have to take it with that notion. And we also know that people who identify as male and who are farmers, there's increased rates of suicide, particularly for those who've experienced, prolonged drought, et cetera, and substance misuse. So there are mental health needs amongst all populations, but what some of the data does tend to show is it skews towards people who identify as female, and for a variety of reasons, self-reporting, but also in caregiver roles, et cetera. So the only other thing I would note too is that Ali mentioned it early on, a lot of this is unpaid work, and guess who tends to do a lot of unpaid work? So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, excellent points. Thanks, Katie. Florence.
I think when you start to talk about things like climate justice, I mean, there are just other forms of injustices that, of course, intersect with that. And unfortunately, toxic masculinity, has really contributed, I think, to the climate problem. And we have to address that, if we're going to address real solutions as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Excellent points, and thank you for joining us and going through with us on this very difficult but also very important topic. So thank you to the panelists, and I will invite Lucas to kind of close our session today.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just adjust the spotlights here. And I guess we know why Zoom cut me off at the beginning now. Just kidding. Thank you so much. I thought that was an incredibly interesting panel. Really, really diverse perspectives, fascinating perspectives from all of you. I appreciate all of you being here. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Pallavi for doing an excellent job moderating. Thank you so much to the rest of the CEP team for helping to make this a reality, and to all of you for spending your evenings here with us, talking about sustainability, talking about mental health. I hope you got some new knowledge and gained some hope, and are inspired to continue working towards solutions and helping more people. So thanks so much. Look forward to seeing you at the next one, and have a good night.